Cool. Yeah. So who set up the order of? What the hell? I mean, my wife came up to me at the break and said, "Feeling the pressure?" This is before I had to follow the Whalers. Yeah. So yeah, 10 years ago, I was so honored to be a part of this. I'm very happy to be back, especially because I went way over last time. And my wife actually spent the last 2 minutes and was like, "Get off, you're done. Get off." And yeah, I'm actually not going to talk about Y'all Fest. I've been thinking about it for the last 2 months, and it just wrapped up Saturday. But I do want to, yeah, it was fantastic. But I mean, it's such a thing that's no longer just, I mean, never was just me, but it's gone so beyond anything I could have ever thought it would be. I think I saw Susan from the Charleston Museum here. We've sort of invaded their space. I mean, we pay them, but we've definitely invaded their space. Our videographer, Drew, is here. Robert loaned us Blue Ion for the party Saturday night. So it's definitely, we've just invaded any space within a block of the store, honestly, where you can stick a writer and a microphone. We've done it. In fact, 7 years ago, we were looking for a place to have a big keynote talk, and I called up a number for the Charleston Museum, and they said, "Well, we don't usually rent it out, but we're starting this new thing. We got this kid who's taken over, and maybe, so that was Charles. So that was how we first met. And I think he's done pretty well for himself. It's been a pleasure. So preamble, done. I don't know if I can pull this off. This is going to be fast. All right. Go, Chris. I'd like to talk today about 2 stories of lost boys. 2 stories of lost children, both wildly popular, both captured the public imagination, both with a lot to say about their places in time. This is not one of them, sorry. First lost boy is actually named Holden Caulfield. He's 16. The book is Catcher in the Rye, set in 1949. He's just flunked out of his 4th boarding school in a row. Saturday, instead of waiting until classes end Wednesday, he leaves that night, doesn't tell his parents he got kicked out, goes AWOL in New York for 2 nights. Forget everything you've thought about this book and just focus on 5 incidents, okay? 2 years before the book starts, when Holden's 14, his brother died. He smashes out all the windows in the garage, permanently damages his hand. A year later at boarding school, a classmate is bullied into jumping out a window to his death while wearing Holden's borrowed turtleneck, okay? Book starts on Saturday. Random coincidence, Holden's roommate, Ward Stradlater, goes on a date with Jane Gallagher. Jane is an old friend of Holden's and love of his life. Holden knows Stradlater's game plan is to take the basketball coach's car and force himself on girls in the back seat. After the date, Holden attacks him, but the much stronger roommate knocks him out. Now, Holden himself is a virgin. He ironically feels sort of guilty about doing the right thing. He admits he's not had sex with girls because they ask him to stop. He says, "The trouble with me is I stop. Most guys don't. I can't help it." After the fight, Holden's so mad he leaves school early, goes to New York, checks into a hotel, goes out, comes back. Later on, he gets talked into having a prostitute up to his room. She turns out to be a teenager. Holden just wants to talk to her. Her pimp fleeces him for an extra $5, punches him in the stomach. All right. Number 5, next night, this is the last part of the book, he tries to crash at the apartment of a former teacher and mentor, wakes up on the couch with the man stroking his head suspiciously. I always thought the guy would have a mustache, but I couldn't find one. So he ends up sleeping in Grand Central Station. There are, of course, a lot of other plot points in the book, but just these 5, I think there's a lot of violence and grown-up trauma for a 16-year-old. We've got 2 children dead, a severe hand wound, the span of 48 hours, 2 beatings by a pimp and a date rapist of teenage girls, brutal heartbreak, near molestation. That's a lot of reality for a book most associated with one word. He uses it 35 times. Anyone think about this book and think of one word? Phony. Typically, when we talk about Catcher in the Rye, we talk about this word phony and his voice, and we talk about themes and angst and alienation and coming of age, but not just what happens. Holden's parents are from a world where you pushed your kids out of the nest as fast as possible. It's 1949. If Holden had been a few years earlier, he would have been expected to enlist. He leaves school in Pennsylvania. He runs away to New York to his home. At one point, he sneaks into his own apartment, talk to his little sister, Phoebe. His parents come home. He hides in the closet. You can hear his mother's voice from behind the closet door. He's literally in the walls. It's like he's home, but he's not. He's in the dark. He lives on the Upper East Side. You guys are at Pecha, Kucha. You're familiar with New York City. All right. This is his apartment, all right? These are all the places he goes. He's trying to connect with cab drivers, musicians, random people. He's in a hotel. People are doing strange things. It's like home, but it's not. It's an alternate version of Manhattan. It's the upside down. So our other lost boy is in Stranger Things Season 1. None of Holden's trauma is directly related to World War II, but J.D. Salinger fought and he was traumatized by the war. This is his reaction. The Slaughterhouse-Five, Catcher in the Rye is about trauma. Stranger Things is about fear. It's a scary story, right? By the 80s, World War II had become considered a good war. It's fought by the greatest generation. Looking at Vietnam, World War II was a simple victory of good over evil. Truth is, those 6 years are the most significant, most traumatic event in human history. 60 million deaths, starvation, 2 atomic bombs. By the 80s, this post-war trauma manifests into fear. The 80s are a time of optimism, some might say false optimism, morning in America, excess. That excess was married to 3 fears. Number 1, technology. 80s culture, tech is menacing, spins out of control. You got war games, Terminator, Superman 3, weird science. It's not user-friendly. It's cold and dehumanizing. The men in the white spacesuits at the end of E.T., Hawkins' lab. Number 2, big 80s fear, drugs. Baby boomers no longer saw acid as a cool experiment. See it as something like radiation with lingering effects. And of course, the big one, nuclear war. When I was a kid, nuclear annihilation was like a blanket hanging over everything, like a weird smell you'd grown used to. So you take the 3 big 80s fears, technology, drugs, nukes, put them all together, get the daughter of an acid test burnout, raised in a cold white laboratory by the Department of Energy to be a weapon against the Soviets. This one goes to 11. But it was not a big fear in the 80s, lost children. Stranger Things comes before Milk Carton Kids. It's an 80s show for our time, showing our current fear of abduction, throwing that onto a time when fears were less intimate and more communal. If Catcher in the Rye calls out parents for loving our children too little, Stranger Things is just before we started to love them too much, before we started locking them inside, and the weakling nerds leave the basement and rescue their friend. This was an actual card that came on TV well into the 80s. You put this on TV now, people would be like, what? Holden and the Stranger Things kids share one thing most kids don't have today is freedom, and they use that freedom only to connect, to help other kids. The old mode of parenting was to give children freedom and make them strong so they could survive on their own, but if the old mode is toxically masculine, what is strength in a nuclear world? The only true strength is sacrifice. The only fight is the fight to connect. Mike is willing to jump off a cliff for Dustin. Elle sacrifices for her friends. Holden doesn't fantasize about stopping the Demogorgon, but he fantasizes about little kids playing in this big field of rye, and I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. That's all I do all day. I just be a catcher in the rye and all. I know it's crazy, but that's the only thing I'd really like to be. Thanks.